Thank you. Good afternoon, and I'm very honored to be here at the BNC Tech Forum. Goodreads. Today, I'm going to talk about book recommendation engines and book discovery online in general. So what is Goodreads? For those of you who aren't that familiar with Goodreads yet, it's the largest site for readers and book recommendations in the world. We have a community of over 7 million members who read and recommend books, write reviews, compare what they're reading, keep track of what they've read, form book clubs, and do a whole lot more than that too. Our mission is to help people discover books that they love and to share those with their friends. We have, over the years, amassed a lot of deep reading data. We have over 250 million books that our users have put on their virtual bookshelves. And as you can see, in 2011, we had a really big year, and it's only growing faster, at over 15 million more books shelved each month. So what does that mean, to shelve a book? Well, anytime you go on Goodreads and you see a book on the site, you'll see this little add to my books button. And if you mouse over that, it'll show a list of your bookshelves that you can put this book onto. And so then you end up with a set of virtual bookshelves where you can show off all your books, the ones that you've read, the ones that you're thinking of reading, and you can also create custom bookshelves based on whatever interests you have or whatever way that you want to categorize the books that you want to read. And so today we have 69 million books that are marked as to read on people's bookshelves. And that's more books than the entire combined collections of the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, and the Boston Public Library systems. And in fact, in January, 5.75 million books were marked as to read. And that's about the size of the Chicago Public Library's collection. So that means that in January, every second, 2 books were discovered on Goodreads. So what are the top books, to-read books in February of this year? This is the Canada edition here. As you can see, Hunger Games and the other books in the Hunger Games series are in the top 12 as everyone's gearing up to watch the movie. There are people who are going to be in the theaters trying to finish off the book before it starts. The Help, obviously, is a very popular book. And Divergent, which won the Goodreads Choice Award last year. And it's probably also getting a lot of crossover interest from people who are reading the Hunger Games and are getting recommended Divergent because it's also a dystopian fantasy novel. A lot of these books are in the long tail. So if you look at the top 40 books that people have been adding to their to-read shelf, that's only 5% of the books that people have added. And if you look at that, and that's that tiny sliver that you see on the left of the larger graph. And if you look at the top 5,000 books, that's 56% of the books that people have added to their to-read shelves. And so 99% of the books that people have been adding to their to-read shelves won't even fit on this chart because they're really down the long tail. And of course, the question that you probably all are thinking is, how did they find these books? 19% of books added to to-read were found during the registration process. So the average engaged reader on Goodreads adds over 30 books to their to-read shelf right after they sign up. And what they see is something similar to this. So they sign up, they indicate which genres are their favorite genres, the ones that they read the most in. And then they can go through genre by genre and rate a bunch of the books that they've read in the past. And as you rate books in the past, that you've read in the past, similar or related books pop up as well that you may have also read, and you can rate those. Or if you haven't read those, a lot of times people are finding like, wow, there are interesting books here that maybe I've heard about, maybe I haven't, but I'm going to take the time to now add it to my to-read list. And if you look at the types of books that people add to their to-read shelf during this registration process, you'll see that it's kind of focused on popular books. So if you look at that chart the way to read it is on your left side, you'll see books that not too many people have added. They're not very popular books. Maybe 100 people have added that. And on the other side of the chart are books that are extremely popular. Like 1 million people have added those books before. And so the peak is really around, in the several thousand, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people have added those books. So those are kind of like reasonably popular books. And it makes sense because we show a lot of those, we purposefully show a lot of the more popular books in these genre pages when you sign up, just so that we have a good chance of letting you rate a book that you've actually read. Now, another 19% of the books that people discover on Goodreads come from searching. And the way it works is, maybe I tell a friend of mine, hey, you've really got to read this book, Ready Player One. And maybe I'm doing it over email, or I'm talking to them in person, or on Facebook, or maybe I pin it on Pinterest. And they go to Goodreads and they type that into the search box, and then they see that Add to My Books button and they add it there. Now, if you look at the kinds of books that people add this way, the distribution is much more long tail. So you'll see that for search, a lot of the books that people add to their to-read are books that are less well-known. Books that only 100 people or 10 people have added to their shelves before. And so people are discovering a vast variety of books from their friends and colleagues. Now, 13% of the books that people add to their to-read come from the Goodreads recommendation system. This was launched in September of last year, and it crunches through all our data and provides personalized recommendations to each reader. I'll go into more detail on how all that works in a little bit. The kind of thing that the user sees is that if you like these books, then here are a bunch of other books that we recommend you read. And the distribution of books that people add from here is we designed the Goodreads recommendation system to specifically hone in on the mid-list sweet spot. We didn't focus it on the really popular books, and we also need to learn enough about the book before we're going to be comfortable recommending it to people. And so I'll go into a bit more detail about exactly why we did that, but as you can see from that chart, the types of books that people are discovering through our recommendations are books that have a medium amount of following. 10,000 people have added the book. 5,000 people have added the book, but not the million book bestsellers. Now, 9% of the books are from friend updates, and the average engaged Goodreads user has about 19 friends. And this is a place for serendipitous discovery. So my friend Louise posts that she's 30% of the way through the bell jar, and she's really liking it. And that makes me think, oh, hey, I know I was supposed to read the bell jar a long time ago, but I haven't gotten around to it. Maybe I should pick it up. And I can also look at the bookshelves that she's created and dig in and see what she's found that she's liked that I might also be interested in. And the distribution here, again, is very broad. You're finding lots of different kinds of books. 2% of books are from giveaways. Goodreads conducts giveaways, free giveaways of books on the site. And in January, we had about 1,000 of those giveaways going and shipped over 8,000 books and had about 800,000 people enter. And this is the single best way to build pre-launch buzz for your book, best free way. And as you can see here, there's a way to enter, for people to enter. It shows them how many copies are available to win, and you can see that thousands of people enter these giveaways all the time. And one of the great things that this does is it gets people to read these books, especially these are generally before the book is actually published, so they're getting advanced reader copies, and they're writing reviews, and that's incredibly helpful in helping people decide whether or not it's a book that they're going to purchase. Now, as expected, these giveaways tend to help drive discovery of books that are not well known because they're brand new. And so you'll see a lot of books that only 100 people have added or 1,000 people have added. Now, those are just a few of the ways that people discover books to read on Goodreads. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that there are a ton of different ways. There is no single way that dominates all the others. It's all a part of the overall system, and you need to provide lots of different ways for different people to discover different types of books. So now this is all on Goodreads, but how do people discover books when they're not on Goodreads? So we surveyed over 3,000 people and asked them, do you often find books from the following sources? And I'll just highlight a few of the interesting data points here. And the first is that once you've gotten a reader to discover an author, you're golden. If they love that author, they're going to come back, they're going to find ways to discover other books that that author has written and read those books. Friends, offline as well as on Goodreads, are an excellent way for people to discover books. 79% often discover from their friends offline, and 64% from updates on Goodreads. And something relevant to our discussion today is that online recommendations are already driving a lot of book discovery. 60% often discover books from the Goodreads recommendation system, and 54% from Amazon's recommendations. What I'm going to do now is highlight a little bit, a few of the recommendation systems that are out there, not necessarily just in the book space, but ones that you can imagine translating well into the book space. But I think before I go into that, the key question that I think we should have in our minds is, what makes a recommendation good? Because you can have a recommendation system that spits out a lot of books, but how do you know if it's actually going to be useful? And I think the first part of that is that it should provide insightful recommendations. By that I mean it's got to use a deep understanding of the book, it's got to use a deep understanding of you, the reader, your preferences, and provide you with books that you're actually going to like to read. Pretty basic, but that's, I think, one of the criteria. The next is that it should be relevant. So I've recently gotten into the topic of North Korea, reading about North Korea. I read this book called Nothing to Envy, which is fantastic. You guys should all read it. I'm currently reading Orphan Master's Son, and I have another book of short stories on my bookshelf at home that I'm waiting to read. So right now, it would be very relevant to give me another book recommendation about Korea or North Korea. What might be less relevant, and therefore less of a good recommendation, would be a book on some other part of the world, the Middle East, or a fantasy novel. Maybe I would like to read that book, but we only have so much time, and if your attention is focused in one area, it's best to give a recommendation that fits what you're looking for at that time. The next thing is that these recommendations should not be obvious. And this is something that I think a lot of recommendation systems overlook. Imagine if you went to your friend or your friendly independent bookseller and you said, you know, I just read the first 2 Harry Potter books. I love them. I'm looking for another book to read. What should I read? And they think for a while, and then they come back to you and they say, you should read the 3rd book. And you'll look at them and think, wow, why did you just waste my time? One, I already knew that I was going to read that book. You know, I know that. I don't need any help there. And 2, instead of giving me a recommendation that I can use, you wasted my time with one that didn't provide any information to me. The last part, which often gets forgotten too, but it is a big issue, is trustworthiness. You should be able to provide recommendations that people can trust. And there are various ways that that can happen. It could be that, you know, your company overall, your system overall has people raving about it, and so you just hear from everyone like, oh my God, I'm getting great recommendations from such and such, and so then you just take it on faith that you're going to get a good recommendation, and when you get a recommendation, you trust it. It could be that you provide a lot of justification for a recommendation. We recommend you this book because you like these other books, and it's similar in this way, and it's got these kind of aspects to it that you're probably going to like. That helps build up trust. So those are the 4 things that I think are really important to think about as you evaluate recommendation systems. Now, a long time ago, one of the basic ways of trying to recommend books to people would be to look at what was popular or had the highest average rating. But the problem with that is that we all have different tastes, especially when it comes to books. If you take Twilight, for example, it's got an average rating of 3.66. Whether or not someone recommends that book to you, aside from it being an obvious and well-known book, it's important to know, are you that person who is part of that 38% who thought that that book was fantastic and rated it a 5-star? Or are you among the 21% who thought, wow, this is not a book I ever want to touch again, I'll rate it 1 or 2 stars? And that makes a huge difference. And if you look at if you take kind of the rounded average rating of 4, you'll see that only 21% of people agreed with kind of the average rating of this book. It's interesting if you look across different verticals out there, as you look at the distribution of ratings, in music, in movies, in books, even in food, wherever it's not kind of a factual question, it's more of an opinion question, and it's based on tastes. The best you generally see is that about 30%, maybe 40% of people agree with the average rating of an item. So that means the majority of the time that average rating is not reflective of what you would think. And so it wouldn't be a great recommendation for you. And we can do better. There are recommendation systems out there that have been around for a while that look at, people also purchased this, or people also clicked on or looked at this. And I took an example here of Hunger Games. And if you look this up on your favorite or not favorite online retailer, you'll see that you'll see those books show up as customers also purchased. And there are problems with this kind of a recommendation system. And obviously Amazon's driving a lot of discovery already online, but it's some of the issues are that it's the popular books that win in this kind of a situation, because they show up a lot if you dig into people's purchasing history. And it's also using implicit preference data. And by that I mean, they're just looking, all they know is that you bought this book and you bought this other book and you bought this other book. They don't know that you bought this book and you hated it, you bought this book, you loved it, and you bought this book for someone else and have no opinion on it. And it has nothing to do with you. You don't like or dislike that book, but you're just not interested in it. And it's that kind of issue actually creates a lot of difficulties for systems like this, because the input data really matter. And it also has an incomplete picture of your tastes as a person, because you probably haven't bought 100% of your books over the entire course of your life from this one retailer. And all they know is what you've bought from them. The last thing I'll point out here is that it lacks context. So everyone sees the same set of books as recommendations. And one of the subtleties it misses is, why is it that you picked Hunger Games and that you like Hunger Games? Is it because it's a dystopian fantasy novel? Is it because then you'd want recommendations in that kind of a genre? Is it because it just has a strong female protagonist? Then maybe you want books that have that kind of trait inside of them. It kind of ignores all of that in this type of system. A lot of you are familiar with Pandora, which has been around for a number of years. And they've had something that they call the Music Genome Project. And the way that this works is that they have about 400 different attributes, and they take every song and they try to reduce it and map it down into 400 attributes. What tags do they have? On this attribute, are they on this side of the scale or that side of the scale? And they call that kind of like getting the DNA of the song, or if you're mathematically inclined, kind of creating an attribute vector for each song. And they have a lot of people actually helping out with tagging these. And I assume at this point they have a lot of automated systems in place as well. Once you have this mathematical representation of a book, of a song, what they do is then they try to figure out this sense of a distance between two different vectors or two different songs. And the shorter that distance, the more similar those songs are, and the more likely that they'll recommend that to you if you liked one of those songs. The issue with this kind of a system today is that it's very important in the quality and how good this system actually is. It's very important that you define the vectors correctly. If you use the wrong characteristics, the wrong attributes, if you scale things incorrectly, the results are not going to be very good. They're going to be garbage. It's going to look random. And it's very important to figure out exactly how you should be calculating that distance between two different things. And to do this well, you need a lot of data. You need a lot of data about how people actually listen to music to tune that system. And I think there are companies that are trying to do this in the book space. There's one in particular, Booklamp, that claims to do something like this, but from my assessment, it's a little bit more similar in name than in the actual implementation. And I think it's something that no one in the book space has really nailed yet. Netflix, obviously, has a very powerful recommendation system, probably one of the first premier recommendation systems online. And as you can see here, I have recommendations from them called cerebral, sci-fi, and fantasy that they've generated based on my taste preferences. And the way they do this is that they first come up with personalized ratings for movies that I have not yet rated. And they do that by doing some kind of simple regressions on the movies that everyone's rated. If I've rated this movie 4 stars, how do I rate this other movie? How do I rate all the other movies that I've rated? 4 stars, 3 stars, 5 stars, and so forth. And then for each movie, what you can come up with is, okay, if this person hasn't rated this movie, let's look at all the other movies they have rated, and we can make a guess based on how they rated those movies, what they're going to rate this one movie. So they use that to predict what you would rate a movie, and overall, I think it works pretty well, at least it does for me. And they have, on top of that, they have expert users tag their movies. So they'll tag it cerebral, they'll tag it sci-fi, fantasy. And then on top of that, they do a lot of data cleansing. And this is a very important step, as I'll go into later. Data is very key to how well your recommendations come out. And so they'll group different tags together, they'll summarize things, they'll take things to a higher level to understand the bigger picture. And then they do one other thing, which is now on parts of their recommendations, not on all of them, is that they'll say, you'll like this because you like these other 2 movies. And they point that out, so you get the sense that, like, okay, I understand what to expect when I click on this movie to rent. Now, Netflix, the biggest impact that Netflix probably had on recommendations is back in 2006 through 2009 when they ran the Netflix Prize. So what that was they put $1 million bounty out there, and they said, anyone can come, we'll give you 100 million data points, real data points from people rating movies. If you can do a certain percentage better than what our system does in predicting how much they're going to like different movies, we'll give you $1 million. And there was this intense period of global innovation in machine learning. Those were years where research in universities, as well as people in their garages, and people in places like AT&T Bell Labs were spending a lot of hours thinking about this, trying new techniques. And they finally had a great data set to really compare ideas on. And the key lessons that came out of that are that there is no single algorithm out there that we know of that is the best recommender. Everyone kind of got to the point where they knew that mathematical ways of modeling this stuff was really the way to go, rather than getting people to do this manually. But what you have to do is find all these different ways of looking at the problem from different angles. Find algorithms that are better in certain cases and others that are better in other cases, and find smart ways to combine those together to create the best recommendations. And data really matters. Anyone working on this prize could see if you used a little bit less data to train your system and test it out, there was no way you were going to get the kind of quality recommendations that you could have used all the data that you'd get your hands on. And so that is another big change that's happening online today, is that, if you've heard of the concept of big data, now finally companies are amassing large databases of user preference information that they can then use to come up with great recommendations. So that was one of the inspirations for me and my team. And in 2008, I got a few of the smartest people I knew together, and we began work on a real-time personalized recommendation engine. Real-time was kind of the key thing for us, because the Netflix prize didn't really tell anyone you have to come up with recommendations quickly. But we knew that for it to be really useful, you can't ask someone to come to your site, rate a whole bunch of books, and then say, thank you, could you come back in a week? We'll probably have some great recommendations for you. You need to tell them right away, here's a book you should read. And so we were working on making things real time, which is actually a pretty tricky algorithmic and engineering problem. And in the fall of 2009, we finally launched Discovereads, which launched with these personalized book recommendations. And for the next year, what we did was we tested new ideas, we refined them, we tested, we refined, we tested the user experience, we tested the algorithms, we changed the way that we showed recommendations to people, how we collected preference data from people, and finally got it to work really well, such that we got the attention of Otis Chandler, CEO of Goodreads. And a little while later, Goodreads acquired Discovereads. And for 6 months, we were heads down focusing on how do we scale this system out to the massive data set that Goodreads has, and how do we retune the system so it works really well based on, Goodreads also actually had a lot of cleaner data than we had back when we were in Discovereads. So then we launched that in September of 2011, and it was just, the response was phenomenal. People had been waiting for this feature for a long time, and the avid readers are actually the ones who, they appreciate recommendations from their friends, but it's never enough because they read so much. And so they rely a lot on recommendations from systems like ours. So the Goodreads recommendation system, how does it work? Well, to the user, it's pretty simple. You come into the site, you rate at least 20 books or more if you want more accurate recommendations, and we learn your personal tastes. Then we provide you with recommendations based on bookshelves that you create. And here's where it gets really powerful, because I can have my information design bookshelf, I can have my Korea bookshelf, and the books that get recommended there are extremely relevant to the other things that I've put on that shelf automatically. So how does it work under the hood? Well, excuse me. We look at how people have shelved 250 million different books. We look at how people have rated 150 million books. And then we combine book editions, we clean up genres, we do a whole lot of other data processing to clean this up. And then we do the algorithmic heavy lifting to figure out how books are related to each other. Not just which books are related, but how they're related to each other. And then we take it a step further and we filter out the obvious relationships. So we delete relationships between the Harry Potter books because we know that that's too obvious. We don't want to waste your time. And we take the output of that and cross that with your personal reading and rating history and how books fit into your life. You know, was The Hunger Games to you a dystopian novel that you want to explore more of? Or was it about female protagonists? And so how does this increase discovery of books? Well, let's take this book, Molokai, by Alan Bennett. And it's a very well-written book. And I think it was published around 2004, 2005. And ever since Goodreads was live, people have been adding this book to their bookshelf. About 10, grew to about 10 to 20 people adding this per day. But it was never it never broke out. It was never a breakout success on Goodreads. And then that spike that you see there happened the day that we launched recommendations. And our system had learned this is a great book, and these are the specific people who would enjoy that book. And ever since then, on average, about 90 to 100 people are adding this book a day. And that's sustained. I mean, that chart goes to, I think, yesterday or the day before. And if you look at, I think about 32,000 people have added this book on Goodreads. About half of those are people who added the book after recommendations launched and they were getting it as a recommendation. So that's how the recommendations are impacting books that are high quality but never quite found enough of their audience. And you see this trend across all the other mid-list books that are getting picked up by the recommendation engine. So taking a step back, what does discovery mean anyway? To us, discovery means all the touch points in the mind of the consumer that it takes for them to decide to go purchase that book. There's an old marketing adage that goes, it takes about 6 to 12 touch points in the mind of the consumer to get to a purchase. And of course, some touch points are stronger than others, and the stronger the touch point, the fewer you need. If your best friend who shares your taste in books tells you that you have to read this book, of course, it's not going to take them 12 times to get you to buy that book. And there was a marketing manager at a large publishing firm who was once quoted as saying, between us and our readership, there's a brick wall, and we have little hammers, and if we keep hitting the wall, eventually we'll punch through it. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to get those touch points. You have to figure out different ways to get that book in front of the right person so that they finally pick it up and purchase. And discovery happens in a lot of ways, as you saw earlier. There is no magic bullet. Anyone that comes to you and says, here's this one new method, here's this one new recommendation system that solves all your problems, they're missing most of the picture. Our system, it's new, it's working well, but it's new. It only does 13% of the books that people discover. And we hope to get that higher, but we're not ever going to get 100% of people's book discovery happening through that system. That's just not the way it works. So a few things to keep in mind. If you're looking at promoting a long-tail book, word of mouth is one of the most effective ways to get the word out about your book. So focus on your core readers, and the Goodreads giveaways can be a great way when you launch the book to get initial awareness among the right people. If you've got a mid-list book on your hands, market to the existing fans as much as possible, and focus on marketing to the comparable people who read the comparable titles. And they'll get your book on the right lists and the right places online such that people will then start picking up your book more. And you've got to make sure that you get enough feedback on your book that the recommendation system picks up. And then, like you saw in that other book, you'll see a dramatic ramp up in people picking up the book. And so to get to a bestseller, what do you do? I mean, if you don't have J.K. Rowling as your client. The focus really should be on maximizing consumer touch points, especially around launching the book. Help the recommendation system learn who the right people are for this book by getting as many people as you can to add that book. Once you get about 100, 200 people adding that book, rating that book, then the system starts churning and understanding. And be ready to capitalize on any media hits. One of the things that we see is that NPR or The Daily Show will cover a book, and there'll be an initial spike of interest based on people searching for that book. And then a little while after that, there's a very sustained amount of adding that book based on your friends. So you see that your friend added that book, so then you go add it. And then your other friend sees that you added that book, so then they go add it, things like that. So we tend to amplify the effect of those media events. So that's all I had for today. I'm happy to take any questions, but I'm also seeing that we're about out of time and lunch is outside the door, so I won't be offended.
I just have a question about the demographics of the Goodreads community. You have all those members. How many of those are Canadian? How many of them are how does it divide up among the categories? Because I'm assuming the more readership you have in a category, the better your rating system and all that.
So the general demographic of the Goodreads user matches the general demographic of readers in the U.S., I believe. We have a lot of people who, maybe half of them read just a few books a year. We probably are heavier weighted on the extremely avid readers, and we're probably about 65% female. And so we actually do have men active on the site as well. And I think this ratio is probably, it's maybe a little more female-centric and slightly more avid reader-centric than the general populace, but it's pretty close. And in terms of Canadian numbers, I don't have the breakout top of mind, but I do know that Canada is one of our top 2-3 countries after the US. And in terms of the types of readers, I'm assuming you're meaning genres. That again is very, very split. There's, literary fiction is probably the biggest group out there, but obviously people read across genres. We have very avid romance readers as well as YA. And one of the things I think that comes up often is we've heard in the past, like, oh, don't you just have a lot of young teenagers who read YA? And the truth of the fact is that nowadays that's not the case at all. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, YA was much more teenager focused. What we find on our site is that the bulk of YA readers are actually people in their mid-20s to late 30s and 40s. And so in terms of age, about half of our users are under 30 and half of our users are over 30. Other questions?
I've actually been a member since 2007.
Great.
But my question is, with the recommendation engine, the readers are adding those books to their to-read shelves, so those aren't necessarily all buys. Do you have numbers for those moving from a to-read to a read shelf?
We will be compiling that data soon. There's a lot of tricky tracking that we're going to be putting in place soon. And that's a big question, where they discovered a book has a greater impact, has some impact on whether they're going to read it quickly or not. We hope to have that answer for you in a future conference. conference. Other questions? Great.